This is the Durable Small Business, a library of content that my team and I at Durable produce and share to connect owners, operators, and company builders in an ongoing exploration into what it takes to build a business that thrives and endures. Today, I'm sitting down with a good friend of mine, Paul Henderson. He's a Utah-based investor and business owner with a diverse portfolio of companies and a career jam-packed with great stories. Paul is joining the Durable community live in person on February 6th, 2025 for a fireside chat with me on stage at Edison House in downtown Salt Lake City. Today's conversation gets into Paul's background in corporate finance across Goldman Sachs, GE, and Apple before taking a screeching left turn in his career to enter the cannabis space. This turn ultimately led him to running High Times Magazine as its CEO for several years before finally exiting the corporate grind to move to Utah, where today he has a collection of small companies from cannabis to the dental space. He'll tell you the full story. On stage, we're going to unpack some of the topics we hit on today, from how to be exceptional at fundraising, how to assess regulatory risk in a market like cannabis, how to leverage AI in a small company, and what it takes to be a good CEO. Today, though, let's get to know Paul, a good friend, a good human, and a stellar operator. This is the Durable Small Business. Thanks for listening. Okay, we are live. Paul, how are you, dude?
Excellent. How are you?
Good. Thanks for being willing to do this. So we have you on stage at Edison House coming up in 2 weeks on February 6th at 7 o'clock. I'm looking forward to diving deep on that. And you're the first person we've done a pre-interview with. We launched a kind of YouTube and podcast for all of these conversations that we're having. And we thought it would be fun to have the digital version be kind of the longer format. And the fireside in person can be a little bit more Q&A, getting into tactics. I figure this would be a fun way to share with our audience you and your background, because you're one of the more interesting entrepreneurs I think I know. And I think our listeners will agree with that in a few minutes here. Will you just briefly, try to keep it to a minute? We'll go back and get the full backstory, but just brief snapshot. Who is Paul Henderson? Talk to me about your portfolio of companies, just current state.
Yep. Yeah. So portfolio of companies first, before I dive into my background, is a couple in the medical cannabis space in Utah. So a little bit unique. A lot of people don't know about the industry in general, but then a state like Utah is even more obscure because it's this little program. So we can dive into that.
Yeah.
But there's two different businesses. There's one business called Beehive Farmacy that owns 2 retail locations, 2 of the 15 in the state, and then 1 cultivation facility, which is 1 of 8 in the state. And then the separate business is called Pure Utah Processing. That is a cannabis manufacturer down in Payson, and that is 1 of 14 in the state. And those businesses combined kind of work symbiotically together. We work different cap tables, different ownership, but they work together every day of the week with each other. So those are kind of the 2 businesses. And then kind of a random, kind of off the wall is a dental implant center in Draper that I got involved with, where I bought in. My wife is a dental hygienist, so I've been around the dental space for about 20 years, and I've always wanted her to kind of buy her own practice and do her own thing. She's never wanted to do it until this opportunity came up last year to buy a practice with a doctor that she knows well. And so we're in the thick of just kind of rolling that out and positioning, rebranding, things like that. So those are kind of, I got a bunch of other little investments and things going on, but that's kind of where I spend most of my time every day here in Utah.
That's wild. I met you a couple of years ago through Kevin Henderson. Some listeners, specifically from the ETA community, may know Kevin on Twitter through SMB Law. You are his older brother, right?
Yeah. Yeah, just slightly older. So there's 6 kids. He's the youngest. I'm 18 months older, and then we have 3 other brothers and a sister. So
That's
it's
awesome.
it was a wild time.
And then we got to know each other real well because, was it last year? Has it been? Maybe we're coming up on 2 years
2
now.
years ago.
Okay.
A year and a half, so October, right?
We set out and with a group of about 10 other entrepreneurs went and tackled Mount Kilimanjaro. So got to know each other real well on the trail and in the camp tent afterward as we were licking our wounds and getting to know each other, sharing war stories. And I want to get into some of the war stories that you told. You just have such a storied career. I think the quirkiest part of your experience has to be when you were CEO of High Times Magazine, which for those that don't know, High Times Magazine is kind of the it magazine for the cannabis industry, lifestyle, advocacy. So maybe how did you find yourself in that role? Because your journey was not always small business. It was corporate finance, then suddenly finding yourself in the cannabis story. Give us maybe the condensed version of how you found yourself running High Times Magazine and the story behind that.
Yeah, it's fun. You say I'm interesting. I actually think I was kind of boring, and I was very boring for a long time because I was just I looked at the big picture and saw, okay, I go to undergrad, I go to MBA, I go to post MBA, type of companies, either finance or consulting or whatever you do. And you work through big corporations into eventually the C suite, right? That was my goal. C suite, Fortune 500, didn't really matter industry. And I was on that path, right? So I started at Goldman Sachs and out of undergrad and was fortunate enough to join their kind of analyst training program. So 3 years of just kind of hardcore training at Goldman. Graduated from that, did some really fun things, built a private bank from scratch at Goldman back in kind of the 2006, 7, 8 era. Got to saw some
So
crazy
leading up to
stuff.
'08, what was, sorry, I want to
Yeah.
double click on that. What was the bank? Why were you forming the
Yeah,
bank?
it was called GS Bank USA, and it actually had to do with the loose banking laws in Utah at that time. And if you know Utah, or if any of your listeners know Utah, they had some pretty loose banking laws, and it's why some major international banks are located in Utah, like American Express or or like BMW Bank. Target has their bank here. When Walmart went through that whole big fiasco, when people freaked out about them launching a bank, they were trying to do it here in Utah.
Oh, I didn't
So
know that.
Utah had some funky rules, yeah, and they closed up all these loopholes. But back in the day,
It was the
early
Wild West.
2000s, it was the Wild West. Yeah. So there's this thing called an industrial loan charter, an ILC from Utah, which allowed any type of company to basically launch a financial services arm like a bank. So anyway, the reason we did it is because Goldman was mostly focusing on investments from very wealthy people in their private wealth division. And to give you an idea, you need to have liquid assets of about 10 million, even to be potentially a client of Goldman Sachs in their private wealth division. So that's kind of what we were talking about. But they also had bank accounts at places like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, which also had wealth
For their
management
retail
arms.
banking.
Yeah. So they would keep $1 million in a checking account, but yet the advisors at Wells Fargo and Bank of America would constantly call them asking them to get their investment dollars. So we were basically like, look, if we launched a retail bank that could help do the same types of services, then our clients aren't
Easy
constantly
layup.
bombarded with phone calls.
Right.
Yeah.
And how were
So
you
we
tapped to go help run the program?
I was employee number two. And so it was everything from consents for sweeping brokerage account cash into deposits for the bank. So we literally, it was project management really. And we
Right.
built the bank with connections to a lot of other people, right? So we had Citibank for ACH. We had Harland for check writing. We had, I don't even remember, for debit processing. It's a big one in the Midwest. So we basically built a multi-billion-dollar bank with like 10 people, and it was all through like partnerships, and because we had the deposits already sitting in the brokerage account. We flipped, so when we went live and we swept the cash out, we went from non-existent to the 50th largest bank in the US overnight by deposit size.
That
So
is
like it
insane.
was crazy. And so we did it. And then once we did it, obviously we have to start paying interest on deposits. And then it was like, okay, now what do we do with all these deposits? And one of those was we created a lending arm of the bank, which then I ended up running, which was lending kind of a whole bunch of like non-common type loans, right? We would do a G550 loan for, a Gulf Stream that's collateralized by a wine collection sitting in Oklahoma, right? For like an oil and gas tycoon.
That
It
must be
was
the
just
most
like,
interesting day to day.
it, yeah, it was fun and it was cool because the clients and the people you're working with, right, are celebrities and,
Sure.
politicians and the who's who of the world that you would know on a day-to-day
Any wild
basis.
stories from that time, or just any kind of things that stand out as you think back on those days?
Yeah, well, it was probably that one was probably the funniest. Was probably the most interesting one was we had to work with Christie's to actually go audit wine collection that was spread across like 8 different temperature controlled cellars in the country, which I didn't know was a thing for rich people, but there are these centralized wine
I'm
cellars.
sure that a wine collection can get so great that you need multiple
Yeah,
states and multiple temperatures. Love that.
exactly. And it was this was a big oil and gas tycoon. I probably shouldn't say who it is. But it was fascinating, and we ended up doing it, and it's like 50% loan to value, and then it's like just we know what it is. The vast majority of this lending was actually securities based lending, so it wasn't that fun. It was actually like, hey, you founded a company and you've got a 500 billion in stock that's now public sitting in your Goldman account, but you can't sell it because you're an insider, you're still running your company. So would basically pull some of those securities into a separate account, and then
Got it.
we would lend cash against that at
Makes
whatever, a
sense.
50% advance rate. So
And so you're cutting your teeth in finance. This is like on
yeah,
the lending side. Were you in your
yeah.
20s, 30s at this point?
Yeah, 20s. So I was a little bit, I won't even back up before then, but I was a little bit abnormal as well, where I didn't go to college right out of high school. I spent a couple of years actually working at Geico Auto Insurance. So when you see those Gecko commercials, I was the guy on the other line answering the phone in San Diego at a call center for the West Coast. And so it was
Where
interesting at the
every
time.
entrepreneur gets their start.
But it was funny though because that was exactly the time that Warren Buffett bought Geico.
Oh,
And
interesting. Yeah.
so in fact he bought it in two tranches. So he bought 50% first and then a couple of years later bought the remaining 50%. And so I actually got to meet Warren Buffett when I'm like an 18-year-old kid in San Diego. He flies into this, has a big event, and like I don't know anything about anything, right? So I'm meeting like somebody that I was like, oh, this guy's interesting, cool, and like that was it, right? And then I got to meet him a couple of years later when he came back when he bought the remaining 50%. But anyway, it's just fascinating time to learn. But I ultimately. And then I ended up serving a 2-year mission in Rio de Janeiro. So I did the point being why I mentioned that is I didn't start college until I was that's like 22 as a freshman. And then I did college in 3 years instead of four. I just went year round through the summers to get it over with. So I ended up joining Goldman at like 25, 26, and then I was there for about 5 years while we did that whole like project. So
Wild.
that was Goldman. I ended up doing my MBA while I was at Goldman. So remember, this is the financial crisis. My entire career was go to work for a couple of years, go get your MBA like everybody does, and then go back to work. Well, the whole world had just fallen apart, right? And so Goldman had an opportunity where I could do an MBA at Carnegie Mellon through a distance program. So it was very unique with a couple corporate sites. So that's what we did. So I spent 2.5 years taking classes year round from Carnegie Mellon, graduated with my MBA, and then leveraged that opportunity, their career center, into my next role, which was actually a leadership development program at General Electric. And GE at the time, well, GE Capital, when it still existed at that time, I ended up into their program, which was all about sales and marketing. So it was front end. I had done a lot of back end project work, finance operations at Goldman, but this was a total flip on its head, which is now I was responsible for like business development on the front end. So got to see a totally different skill set, which I thought was fascinating, but I also wanted to build that for myself to have a well-rounded like business perspective. So that was a really great experience. I got to do 2 years in what's called their Experience Leadership Development Program, ECLP. And it's basically to build leaders, right, in their businesses. But it was very cool. I got to work on some real estate projects where GE Capital was divesting of equity real estate. They were still doing some debt at the time, but we had to work out of a lot of stuff that they got into leading up to 2008. And then I got into the alternative fuel, alternative fuel vehicle space. So GE Capital was the largest owner of vehicles at that time, and then they would lease them to corporations. So like ADT's service vans, they would have 100,000 in the
Interesting.
U.S.
Right.
GE owned those, and they
Right.
would have all sorts of services. Well, what we decided during this time was it was when everything started to shift to started with compressed natural gas, and then it went to electric. And so I got to work with major corporations that were thinking about converting a portion of their fleet to natural gas, mostly for environmental type internal goals that they might have, right? Reduction of CO2, whatever. And so every company had a different agenda and why they wanted to do it. Some of it was to save money, but not always. And then electric started to come out of that. In fact, what's fascinating is I got to drive a Series 3 BMW electric that never existed. Like it never actually
It was
produced it.
like
It
a
was like a
concept car.
one-off. Yeah, and they shipped it out to Minnesota where GE Capital had the headquarters in Eden Prairie in Minneapolis. And we actually built a track to allow kind of fleet managers to come in and test all these different types of vehicles. Yeah. So anyway, two-door, 3 Series BMW full electric. It was so awesome. But yeah,
That's
never
cool.
for some reason they ended up going the like I4
Yeah.
route, three and then I8 and
That's
then
right.
kind
I
of from
three.
there. So
So I'm curious.
yeah,
I don't want to skip here, but just while we're
yeah,
talking about it, you had so many interesting experiences in corporate.
yeah,
And there's folks who come to startups or building a small business or acquiring a small business with corporate experience, and there's some who come without corporate experience. What are like the pros and cons of coming in with corporate experience? Like, how has that shaped your career?
yeah,
What like you're in front of some incredibly large, important initiatives. You're working with smart people, but you're also the playbook that works in corporate is so different from what
yeah.
works in startups. How do you think about that?
I think it has to do with your personality, and everybody's going to be different. But what I see, if you're somebody that bangs your head against the wall at your corporate job and you're like, why are we doing this? Why does it take 3 weeks to do this? It should take a day or less. And so if you're constantly frustrated, entrepreneurship is probably the right move, right? And that's kind of how I was. Excuse me. At some point, I had to, um, at some point, I had to really look at it and be like, is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my career? Right. And some
Right.
people do decide that, and you see them running big corporations, right? They just stuck with it. And I look back at that and think, man, I could never have done that. I could never stayed with all the red tape and bureaucracy of a large corporation. The positives is that I saw how to run a real company that is responsible for billions of dollars of revenue, and how you manage expenses and how you should hire and think about hiring, when you hire, how you do product development. After GE, I was at Apple, and Apple was fascinating because I learned that you don't have to be first to anything. Apple is notoriously never the innovator or pioneer of
Correct.
anything in their categories. They're always a fast follower, but they're a follower with a better user interface, better technology, better whatever, right? And so you see that with the phone and the iPod and the iPad and whatever,
And hopefully
even
we'll see it
even
with
the Mac.
AI, but remains to be seen at
Yeah,
this moment.
yeah, 100. I'm less confident about Siri, but yeah, but it was fascinating to see and understand that, like, there's no one way to do anything. There's no right way. And in fact, when I help advise some companies that I invest into, is I have this conversation a lot. Is like, look, I know that this investor told you to do this, but that's not the only way to do it. There's 10 different ways. And pick the way that best aligns with your personality, because you're running this company. Don't try and run your company with somebody else's like gifts and personality, right? And so you have to kind of find your own way. And I think being exposed to a handful of very large corporations gave me that perspective to be able to pick and choose. Like, okay, I really liked what we did over here. I love what we did here. I hated what we did with, performance reviews here. So ditch that. And so I was able to basically look back over a decade and grab all these little pieces of the way that I wanted to run my companies.
Yeah. Where do you feel like it can hold an entrepreneur back, though? Like it seemed like it worked really
Yeah.
well for you in a lot of those reasons, but as you're writing checks into entrepreneurs who have corporate background, are there any kind of common traps you see
Yeah.
them fall into?
Yeah, I think that if you're young, or if you're just less experienced, maybe in big corporate, you tend to just try a lot of stuff because you don't know any better. And big corporate experience can hurt you because you can say, well, I saw people do this at this last company and it didn't work. And so I'm not even going to go try it. Right. And so I think sometimes it'll put up artificial barriers and roadblocks to things that you should be going and doing and trying, even if you fail at them, because you're going to get better and better in your process. And then not only that, but then also like the divisions and departments, right? When I'm at big corporate, and I want to hire somebody, I just call the HR recruiting team and say, "Hey, we have this open rec. Can you go handle it?" And they do, and then they ping you as you need it, but they go handle the whole process. Well, until you're in your own company and you realize that, oh, that process takes a while, and here's all the steps, and now I have to go do them myself. It's super easy to rely on all those teams, the finance
Right.
team and the
And
marketing
for the
team and
right
HR
personality,
team,
it can be freeing. For the wrong personality, it can be a complete overwhelm of not having
handcuffs.
that
Yeah,
ecosystem of support.
yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's why I think, you have to really be honest with yourself and like ask the questions and really understand the like, hey, do I know enough about marketing and operations and finance and HR to basically step into this business ownership and
Yeah.
do it?
Yeah.
And like part of you is like, if you don't know, that's okay, but do you have the passion and willingness to go tackle it and figure it out and go read and watch videos,
Yeah. The
listen to podcasts?
tenacity.
And yeah. And so if you're willing to go do those things, there's nothing that will stop you. But those, I do see that those are the little inclinations that if there's somebody that's a lifelong corporate employee that now is branching off into entrepreneurship, I do have those questions and reservations in the back of my mind of, does he realize what it's actually going to take to be successful here? And is he willing to put in that work? And those are kind of, if those two questions are yes, yeah, okay, all right, cool, we're
Yeah,
good.
it's kind of like that. What do they say? Of the best advice you should give to someone asking if they should go start a company or acquire a company is tell them no, because if they listen to your advice, that was the right advice, and if they don't listen to your advice, they weren't going to listen to you anyway.
This is exactly right. Perfectly
All
sums it
right,
up.
we'll get into more of this later. So you're at Apple. We're getting closer to
Yeah.
how you get
Yeah.
into the cannabis space and start kind of learning
Yeah.
about the industry. But take us from Apple forward.
Yeah, so Apple was fascinating. You might see this theme in my career that I get dumped into these ridiculous situations. So like the day before I was joining Apple, I got a call from my incoming boss's boss, and he said, "Hey, we're restructuring the entire organization, and the guy that you had interviewed with that you're coming to work for is moving to a different division, and you're now going to be in charge of global financing programs." Whereas I was coming in to run just North America. So this was a big shift from US to global. And I was like, and then he said, and you got a couple of weeks to pull together your thoughts and plans for this division. And we're going to present to the new CFO, Luca Maestri, in a couple of weeks. All right, great. So I started day one with like, wow, here we go, which
Wild.
was again fascinating. Just, you just had to
Were you
learn
out in
separate things
Cupertino in
off.
California? Were you commuting
Yeah.
in?
Yeah. Yeah. So at this time, so I moved from Minneapolis to the Bay Area. I was living in Morgan Hill, if anybody's familiar with it, and commuting up just north of San Jose to Cupertino. So I was at the headquarters. I was there at the old Infinite Loop headquarters. The spaceship had not been built. It was under construction while I was there. And then I ended up leaving before it was complete, and then they moved in. But yeah, it was an interesting business. Basically, what we did was we lent to well let me think about it. The financing business for Apple was three prongs. It was consumer, it was business, and then it was sorry, education, and then enterprise. So education had been around forever, right? Apple cut its teeth in education since the 80s. And then consumer started to get pretty big, but enterprise had really not become anything. And
Yeah,
so Tim Cook, if you guys remember years ago, was announcing, hey, Apple's big push into the enterprise. This was actually what he didn't tell in the story that nobody really told was the evolution of Apple in the enterprise was the iPhone, because corporate executives came in and they basically said, hey, IT, I'm using an iPhone in my business. I don't
figure
care
it out.
what you tell me, figure it out. I'm not using a BlackBerry anymore. And they did. They figured it out. They figured out the network, the security, all that. And then iPads came right after that. And then Macs started to trickle in right after that in a big way. So we saw kind of this big
So that
evolutionary
consumer
movement into
pull forced
enterprise.
Apple to
Yeah.
get a
Yeah.
little more bullish on getting into
Yep.
enterprise.
And so, yeah, and then we did all the financing. So there would be a sales guy that would actually structure that whole deal. And then my team would come in and say, okay, we're doing 200,000 iPads for service technicians for ADT. Right. And so we would ship those out, and then we would finance those over like a 3-year type lease. Some of them would be dollar out leases. Some would be fair market value leases with residual values at the end. And a cool fact about this is that the, the residual value curves that we did with Apple products is now why the iPhone upgrade program exists at the consumer level. So the consumer division took all of
Interesting.
our work in enterprise, and they realized what was the payment that had to be made over a period of time, what the residual value was when they take the phones back and ship them to Africa after they've been
Right.
refurbished. So it was very cool
And
to
now
kind of
it's an
see all that. And
incredibly
then now
profitable business unit.
very, very profitable. Yeah, it's very
Interesting.
cool. So
So
that's kind of,
you were
yeah.
reporting to CFO at Apple. What was it like working at Apple at a high level? What were the teams like? Lessons learned, culture?
The easiest way to put it is that if I were to ever go back to a Fortune 50 company, Apple would be the only one I'd go to. Like that's how much I loved it. It was an incredible experience. The people just brilliant, right? They
This was Tim
also,
Cook era, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
5 years.
2013 to 16. Yeah. Yeah. So kind of the big change. A lot of people also, I don't need to get into this on this podcast, but Tim Cook was an incredible CEO because he was operations driven. He was supply chain. People give Steve Jobs all the credit, which credit is due for the innovation and the new
Product
products.
innovation.
Brilliant mind. But if you look at the scale of where Apple was under Jobs and where that is today, it's completely different worlds. And those are two totally different skill sets.
Right.
And the best way that I heard to explain it, which I think, and I use it still to this day, was Steve Jobs was a wartime CEO. Tim Cook is a peacetime CEO. Two very different skill sets, two very different times, but one company, right? And so when you're dealing
Do
with
you think
different
we're
things, you
entering
just,
wartime now, though? Like it seems like times are changing, right?
I do. I think that this is this next evolution, kind of what's going to happen in tech and software and hardware with the advent of kind of AI and just the rapid evolution. That if you're not innovating as a big company now, you are going to be eaten apart by smaller companies.
Right. It seems like it's wartime in
Yeah.
every tech
Yeah.
company today, wanting
Yep.
to keep up with the rate of change. But you were
Yeah.
mentioning that would be kind of the only culture you'd be willing to go back to. What was it about the environment? Why was it so different?
But almost totally autonomous in that like, I mean, the stupid things, like they don't care what you dressed like. Like literally you would have the most brilliant programmers in their pajamas in the office. Like it was just weird, but it was cool because they just let everybody do whatever they wanted to do as long as they got the best work out of you. And so it was the first time, kind of like Google, first time where you see, okay, food on campus is free. Like they want you to stay around forever on campus, working hard. But it was just a collection of brilliant people doing really good work with like really cool products. Like I was so proud to like go out into the public, go to conferences and say that I'm with Apple. And it was,
Yeah.
it felt good, right? Whereas you can't always say that when the companies you work for.
Interesting. So it totally lived up
And
to the reputation in that way.
yeah, yeah,
Any
it did.
stories, interactions with Tim Cook, or any just kind of fun stories before we move on from Apple?
I didn't spend a ton of time with Tim Cook, but one of the coolest things was in the summer, every Friday, they would basically shut down halfway through the day. Whatever artist was in town meeting with the Apple Music team or the iTunes team back then, they would actually throw a concert in the quad just for Apple employees. So and everybody would go, including Tim Cook. So Tim Cook would be there jamming to like Black Eyed Peas, like just in the quad of Apple. And it was super fun. They bring in local like food, beer, and wine vendors of like around in the region in the Bay Area to support them. And it was just like a free for all party for the whole summer. So I got Lady Antebellum, I saw Pharrell, saw Black Eyed Peas, and just anyway, it was just a blast. And
What a
seeing
time
the
to be at
executives
Apple.
just cooking up there, just having a lot of fun is really really great.
All right. So I think it's about this time you start getting acquainted with the cannabis industry.
Yeah, so I got introduced to a cannabis CEO that was just south of the Bay Area and was running an edibles company. Somebody I knew was an investor in that company and just wanted me to go meet with them, so I did. Anyway, long story short, I ended up as the CFO of his company. Totally not planned, not expected. I didn't really know much about the cannabis industry, to be honest, growing up. I didn't really know where it was in California and its status of like medical
Yeah.
to rec. But remember, this is 2016, so it's the year that they actually voted for adult use legalization in November. So I joined the company in the summer, but it wasn't implemented until January of 2018. So it was basically a year and a half of
A
work to get
long
ready
implementation
for,
period.
yeah, that we had to write all the rules, which was crazy. Um, the Sacramento had to set up the office of cannabis control, and so it was interesting to be part of all that and see the evolution of that kind of coming up
Well, I feel
because
like I need to understand something because this is the first major departure in your career trajectory,
yeah,
right? You're leaving
yeah.
a corporate kind of high powered gig with probably pretty cool upward mobility, big budget authority. What led you to be interested in joining the CFO of this startup,
It was,
really?
yeah, it was just one of those like, it's just one of those weird things that when you're in the Bay Area, especially, it feels like everybody's an entrepreneur and
Yeah,
everybody's
it's kind of
doing awesome
infectious.
stuff. Yeah, totally infectious. And so I really kind of caught that bug while I was there. And as I started looking around, I was like, I should probably just jump into like something early and innovative and cutting edge tech and whatever's happening in Silicon Valley. And so I started to look around, and of course, I ended up in the cannabis
Yeah.
industry, agriculture.
Bullseye.
So I know, right? So it wasn't planned. I wasn't looking for it. It just kind of popped up. And then the more I always say that I made the mistake of going down the rabbit hole of the cannabis industry and just the history and what happened and where we were in that moment of time. And I thought it would be fascinating to be part of that evolution of the growing up of an industry or really the launching of an industry from scratch.
If we were
And
talking
it
at that
was.
moment, sell me on that. Why? What got you so passionate about that? Like, what were you thinking about?
Yeah, it was okay. So the easiest way to explain it is think about Whole Foods in like the 90s, not the company Whole Foods, but like actual like natural foods that were they were a like a subculture. A handful of people around the country, let's just say the US, would go to specialized bodegas to find the organic fruit, the organic vegetables, right? But it was a movement. People like thought it was important for their health, so they would go seek it out. But there was really no guarantee that natural food, organic foods were really going to become anything massive in the US. But over time, they did. I mean, now you see entire grocery store aisles at, Safeway in California or here, at any grocery store, Smith's, et cetera. And and so those companies took a massive risk along the way to like convert their businesses to more organic. Are the people going to come? Are they going to spend money on this? It's more expensive. Will they spend more on a markup? Okay, so now stop there. Now go back. You have the cannabis industry. You're launching this in California. We're talking about 2016. You already have billions of dollars being spent on this product. You already know the demand is there. You're
Right.
simply moving demand from this column to
to that
this
column.
column. So this is the illicit market. This is now the licensed legal market. How do you build the bridge from people spending money here to people spending money
And did
here?
you just see it as there's product market fit, there's demand, it's a legal inevitability? Is that how you
Yeah,
saw it?
that's exactly right. That was exactly how I saw it. Was like, look, this is happening no matter what. People are already spending money, so this transition is going to happen. How do you build the best contraption to capture the most market share, capital, reputation, whatever you want to call it? How do you build that? And that's what I thought fascinating is, to me, it was just a massive business challenge of like an entire industry emerging, but with the complications of, the government oversight and the way that the licensing is done and the controlled narcotics. Like it's never a dull moment, I'll tell you
So
that.
your corporate finance mind was this is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so take us forward. So you
So
joined the
okay,
startup.
so that was that honestly, it's funny. I only lasted a year and a half in that first role. Left for a lot of different reasons, but ended up joining as the CEO of a crosstown rival that was probably 2 years behind the company that I joined as the CFO. And so essentially, they were like, "Hey, we need to do the same thing that you just did over there. We just need to do it here." And the one difference with the new company I joined as CEO was they had won some retail licenses, whereas the previous company was mostly around wholesale. And so that's what we did. We got to work, raised $25 million and took that company from almost non-existent, so 2 million in revenue, to about 80 million in revenue in 3 years. And people like, oh, you hear that number and you go, oh wow, that's incredible, that's cool growth. But living that growth is like, and it
Insane.
as an entrepreneur, it's insane. It's
Yeah.
just trying to
You're
hold
breaking
on. And
everything, including
yeah,
yourself. You're churning through
yeah,
people. You're 100%.
yeah. And so it was unruly, but it was incredibly fun. This is the first time that I'm sitting in the seat responsible for a corporation, right? And as the CFO previously, I was helping make the decisions, but now I'm the CEO and I learn more than I've ever learned in my career up to that point. So
Why
this is
is it?
kind of
Was it
like,
that the buck stopped with you and the emotion of like the ownership, or what? Why did you learn so much in that accelerated period?
yeah, because remember that what I mentioned with corporate, where you have so many different pieces that you can rely on. Now I had to rely on a lot of my training that I had gone through, where I had to walk into a meeting and immediately be able to talk about operation, supply chains. I had to talk about marketing in a different meeting. I talked about finance in a different meeting, fundraising versus corporate finance, very different. And then HR, kind of hiring and firing, making sure we're
So
in the
the
rules.
support system was gone, the crutches were gone. You just had to show up and get
Yeah.
it done.
Yeah. And then the most important thing I think I learned was really corporate hygiene and how you actually run a company, from keeping track of board minutes, right? And how you communicate with the investors, and how, you deal with founders as a hired gun CEO, which is so different than if you're the founder of the company yourself, right? Because now you are
Sure.
working for them. And a lot of times, what I learned was the CEO has to go execute what the board kind of hands down. I can present my management plan or what I think is the right way to do, but if they tell me to go do this, that's what I'm going to execute, even if I feel it's a slightly wrong direction that we are going, which that happens. And right, it's a lot of young people in the cannabis space don't really know what they're doing, but they want to believe that they're
Oh,
very
interesting.
smart, and they tell you to go
And
do
you're
this and
probably
this.
not working with a
So
very sophisticated, I shouldn't say that. You're probably not working with
no,
the most corporate background at a board level.
correct. That's exactly the right way to put it. Yeah. Like probably some of the smartest people I've ever met in the
Sharp,
cannabis space
smart,
that
but
came
maybe a
up,
little
that
unruly.
can math calculations between ounces and grams in their head with dollars. Like it's incredible, right? And so, yeah, you saw some really, really smart that sometimes they just either didn't want to go into any other career, or this is like their calling from an early age and they just moved right into the cannabis space. And most of the experience is in the illicit market. So most of their experience is actually evading taxes, is not keeping any records of anything because it's proof of, illegal activity. So think about
Wild.
taking that type of mentality and shifting it over to a, hey, now we need to file everything every month at the state. We have compliance oversight from Sacramento. They're coming to visit. All these things have to be on point. So yeah, the compliance thing was just nuts.
All right, with your wisdom and a decade to look back on, report card on yourself as a first-time CEO. What'd you do well? What'd you not do well?
I did pretty well. I felt that I really had the reins of the company. I've learned that I'm incredibly good at fundraising, even though I don't love it. And mostly that just is a function of communication style, very clear and transparent, having all of the right documents at, when they need it. So either the deck to present and then the immediate follow up. So a lot of just organizational, getting people excited about a story. So a lot of what we talk about, I think, you probably know this in entrepreneurship, is that you got to be a great storyteller. You want to sell your product, you want to sell your company, you want anything you want to do, you have to be able to tell a story. So I learned probably the most about that. The challenges were really personnel related, which maybe isn't a big surprise for anybody listening that runs companies, and really understanding how to deal with different types of people. And, it was the first time that understanding that people have different agendas. They're not always on the same boat. Even though they're working for your company, they may be angling for something totally different. And so every time I have conversations, I got to be thinking, hey, is this for the right motive or is this for the personal motive? So there was a lot of things around that. I would have been a little more forceful on the view of the way I thought things should be going versus a little bit more passive at the board level of like, okay, if that's what you guys want to do, that's great. I've told you what I think, but I'm happy to go execute. Which I'll tell you that when I mentioned that, this is the second time I mentioned it, I would say that the overarching issue with that specific company was they wanted to go do everything and be the best at every piece of the supply chain, right? Everything from owning real estate to growing cannabis, manufacturing cannabis, distributing it to other companies wholesale, and then running your own retail store. Each one of those pieces of the supply chain are vastly different industries, everything from agriculture to distribution to retail, totally different. So my philosophy was, hey, why don't we pick one, go execute extremely well in that one thing. And then once we've nailed it, let's back up and then do it again and then do it again and kind of go piecemeal. Whereas we had just raised the money and they wanted to deploy capital into every one of those business units to go build them up at the same time, which ultimately everything's more expensive and takes more time. That's just a traditional like rule in business. And so ultimately that's what happened. It's like everything got stood up. We were making a great revenue. The problem was we weren't executing any one of those businesses at a high level. And you eventually run out of money because you're not profitable in any one of the businesses. And then you got to go raise more capital. And then you have sunk cost fallacy where, hey, I've already put all that money in there. So let's not like stop, right? So you dump more money in. And that's ultimately that experience.
What a cool, I'll bet you learned so much in those couple of years.
Yeah,
to fast forward us awesome. A little bit, for those who don't know, what is High Times and then how'd you get there?
Yeah. High Times magazine started in the 70s and was actually it was kind of a joke. It launched as a joke, a gentleman by the name of Tom Forsad in New York City. And it was actually a spoof on Playboy with the centerfold. And so it was a cannabis magazine that had a centerfold dropout of a close-up picture of a bud, like of cannabis.
I actually did not know this.
So it was actually a total joke until it turned into like a top 10 distributed magazine globally in the like 80s, right? So, and
I didn't
funny
realize
enough
it was
is that
top 10.
Yeah, it was fat. It was way up there, way up there. And so it was funny enough. An interesting story is it didn't start as a cannabis magazine. It actually started as alternative drugs. So the first cover of High Times magazine in '78 actually has mushrooms on the cover, which is cool now as it's coming back full circle.
No kidding.
And so, but in the 80s, there was a lot of talk around MDMA and cocaine and heroin and just all types of drugs, right? Well, Tom Forsad actually ended up committing suicide, and the High Times magazine was taken over by some of his extended family and his lawyer. And so they ran it for the next 40 years. And what they decided to do in the 90s was get rid of all the other kind of drugs and double down on cannabis. And so that's why people know High Times magazine as a cannabis magazine.
Because that was the safer, more conservative bet. That was the...
I really don't know why. I think it's just that cannabis became more popular. It wasn't as harmful, I think, to people. So it was less,
okay.
Being out there. So anyway, incredible magazine. Been around for it. Still is printed up until when I joined. I joined. I had left the other cannabis company, not sure what I was going to do. And then High Times called me and said, hey, we're thinking about pivoting our business model from just media, so magazine, and the vast majority of revenue was actually events. So the Cannabis Cup events where you host a weekend festival, great music talent, lots of vendors showing off cannabis. Before legalization, those things were like the Wild West. You could buy, your cash there, buying whatever you want at this event. Ultimately, once legalization starts to hit state by state, the whole business model kind of flips on its head. But High Times was thinking about using its IP of actually making its own products, opening its own retail stores, doing things like that. And so anyway, so that's when I ended up joining, first as the president for a couple of years, helped run that execution of that strategy, mostly starting in California, setting up retail stores, setting up the High Times brand. So we sold flower and joints and vape cartridges, et cetera. And anyway, it was very successful. Then I stepped into the CEO role about 2 years in, and then spent another couple of years as the CEO. They ran into a bunch of challenges like a lot of the cannabis companies are running into right now. And ultimately, a lot of it was a funding issue. And then COVID hit and basically disrupted the whole events business. So 90% of our revenue was wiped out with COVID. And so we had to pivot so fast to get these other business units up and running. But it takes a long time and a lot of money to hit profitability with those business units, and just kind of ran into some struggles there. So, but anyway, I left that about a year and a half ago to just focus on my own stuff, which is where I'm at now. And in the state of Utah, in fact, I just had a guy, one of our investors in our Utah business was in town this week. And we were just catching up, man. And I've known him for years. So he knew all my time at High Times and everything. And he's just like, how are you doing? I'm like, dude, I am loving life. Like, I'm healthier than I've ever been. I'm more relaxed than I've ever been. I'm making more money than I ever have. Like, it just, when you give up like the chase of like, I don't know what it was, the Fortune 50 CEO type role, or even the chase of like the small businesses, but building into something massive, right? Because I was hired to go do that, build massive. You just have that stress. And now I've just kind of flipped it all on the head and just said, you know what? These business here are super small. It's a great state. It's confined, and I can do exactly what I want to do, what I know how to do. And I can make, it's very profitable here. So I can make a lot of money. So a few people have approached me. They're like, hey, go grab that new license that's coming out in Kentucky, or go apply for this and go set up that. And I'm like, I could make more money, but why? Like, what's the point? I'm actually just super content and super happy. So
What helped you
that's where I'm
get
at
there,
right
do you
now.
think? Because I've even, in the short time I've known you, I've seen you go through the health transformation and
Yeah.
how relaxed you are.
Yeah.
And it's been cool to watch you develop as a human. What
Yeah.
helped you get there though?
I appreciate it. Funny enough, it was probably the type 2 diabetes diagnosis, because I didn't realize just how fast I had just been running for 2 decades and hadn't really prioritized anything for myself, even as things as far as vacations go, right? I was the guy that didn't take any time and just worked year round. And so basically, and it wasn't just like, oh, I got diagnosed, like my A1C was off the charts this way. And so it was like, whoa, like if I don't do something serious and dramatic, like this could have dire consequences. And, who knows, where this leads or how much longer, like, do I lose my legs, right? It's like things like that start to all of a sudden become like things you think about, and it becomes scary. And all of a sudden it's like, you know what, maybe certain things that you thought in life weren't as important. And it was funny because the way that like I viewed like health is I would go do activities, and I always loved the outdoors and everything. But when you're at multiple meetings, dinner meetings, lunch meetings a day, and you're on the road constantly and you're eating,
It's
and
impossible.
then there's no gyms at certain hotels, and then you're on flights overnight. So just the inconsistency of like your health and eating and exercise was really challenging. And now where I, travel a couple of times a year now, and I'm at the gym, 4 or 5 times a week, and totally changed my, what I eat and routine with a little help of medication. It's like, I don't know. I'm so getting that like wrangled and in control was so important. It was the only thing I focused on, that everything else just kind of took care of itself, including the businesses. And it's like, it's now I'm kind of seeing it coming out of the other end of like, that was a really good transformation and a really good thing, just to take a step back, take a breath, figure out what I really need to prioritize, which I felt was health at the time. And all the downstream effects are really have been very positive.
That's cool, man. It's fun to see it. That's
Yeah.
that's inspiring, and it's a message I think more need to hear. I don't know if like, because I went through a similar transition myself, not with the diagnosis, but just kind of getting off of a train that was not serving me onto a different one. And I was about to
Yeah.
say more people need to hear that message that you just shared. But do you think if you heard it 10 years ago, you would have listened? Like,
Yeah.
you just kind of have to learn
No.
it yourself?
You have to, yeah. In fact, I probably would have said people that had given up the drive was like, like, what are you doing? Like, you just gave up hope of like, I don't know. It was weird. It was like, I was like, if I would have looked at myself now 10 years ago, I'd have been like, you're a loser. Like, what are you doing? Like, like, you're losing at life. You're losing the game. Like, let's go get out there. So yeah, everybody has their own. And sometimes it's not health for somebody else. It might be,
Sure,
something happens with a sibling or whatever. It's just something
sure.
changes in your mind. In fact, I talk about this a lot in Canada. This is a good connection in that a lot of people grew up in the dare era, right? My era growing up through school was
Yeah,
the
totally.
say no to drugs.
Yeah, I still
And
have the
and
T-shirt
so
somewhere.
yeah, yeah. So you have a bunch of lawmakers that have gone through all of that programming that all drugs are bad. And funny enough is that you don't generally see a flip in their mindset until they have somebody close to them that goes through something that they end up treating with cannabis, and their whole worldview changes. I mean, I've seen it happen over and over again, especially with very religious people, because again, you're taught certain things, and ultimately you have to ask the question. You have to be open to, hey, maybe I was programmed in the wrong way. Maybe I learned the wrong things. Maybe the people that taught me all this stuff wasn't the truth. And so if you have the intellectual curiosity to go dig and start looking, all of a sudden it starts to change your mindset. So I've seen very, very conservative lawmakers, even here in Utah, that had, a family member that went through end of life cancer treatment, and cannabis was the only thing that allowed them to eat anything, stay alive longer, right? Didn't cure cancer, right? Never going to claim that, but it made their end of life journey so much more enjoyable that that person saw it, and now their whole world has changed. And I've seen that hundreds of times.
Yeah. All right. We've got so much more we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks on stage.
Great.
This was a good
Yeah.
primer. I want to wrap up, though. What advice, Paul, do you find yourself giving most often to entrepreneurs earlier in the journey? Or like what kinds of lessons have crystallized for you in the past 10 years that you find yourself trying to impart on other company builders?
Yeah, you have to start. You just have to start. And a lot of people talk about that in like tech terms of like MVP, minimum viable product. But you will come across people that will talk about things forever and never actually do anything about it. And that's just the thing that I've learned is like, even if it's you're at a corporation and you have an idea, try something, right? I've been playing with these new no code tools like Replit to build software without a coding background. And it's unbelievable. And I'm 40, I'll be 45 this year, and I'm completely dedicating myself to learning new things right now that are going to help me for the next 20 years. And so I think it's just try something, put something out there, do a side hustle that's like maybe it's around a holiday and you have an idea. And so it's only going to last 2 months, the planning, the sales process, the closing it up, see what happens, understand what your sales were, what your margins were, where you got the product, if it was, or was it a digital product? And so I think there's so many little things, and the future is going in this direction. I think that large corporations are going to be shaken up. I think they're going to break up. I think the advent of a lot of these new tools are going to it's going to decrease the competitive advantage that larger corporations have over smaller corporations, which means I think you're going to see this fracture of tons of small companies.
I think you're
And
right. I think it will also increase the gulf, though, of those who adopt and commit themselves to learning and change and like really adopting some of the new
yeah,
technology versus those that do not. So I think there's a message of hope, but there's also like a message of fear as well, of like you've got to
yeah,
navigate the next several years.
understand what's going on, and then how do you position yourself for that? And if you can understand those two things and spend some time thinking about it, then and we can talk a lot more about this on stage because I have some cool examples and ideas and thoughts about where the future is going over the next couple of decades. So
But your
that'd be
advice
fun.
is get in the game. That is that kind of the
Get
TLDR.
in. That's it. Yeah, yeah. Just
I love
try
it.
it. You're going to learn something. Yeah.
I love it. Paul, man, it's always so fun to chat with you. A little more fun when
Likewise,
it's
man.
on a mountain in a foreign
I
land, but
know.
this works
Way
too.
more fun. Right on.
Okay, well, thanks for
All
taking
right,
time out of your
Chase.
schedule, Paul. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Likewise. Thanks, man. Bye.
Okay, bye.